And as you have just heard, this meeting will be recorded and will be available later on YouTube. What are the objectives for this event and for us bringing this group of people and this wonderful panel together? First, we want to present key findings and discuss them about a report we just put out. It's Sustainable Adaptation Pathways. It was published by the German Environment Agency and was written by Ecologic Institute with support from colleagues from the Free University in particular. And you will see the link to the study in the chat in a minute. And we want to think together across communities. So we have expertise from global to local on our panel, and the participants to this event today come from all over the world. We have actually 46 countries which are represented by participants, and they come from 5 continents. So welcome, world. We also want to learn from good practice examples to improve livelihoods for tomorrow in a fragile world. So what can you expect today? First, we will have an introductory keynote by Dirk Messner. That will be followed by a presentation by Jenny Trölsch. I will introduce the people in a second. And then followed by the panel discussion, where you can also add your questions via the Q&A part of this Zoom meeting. And these Q&As will be collected then and presented by my wonderful colleague, Benedikt Boeb. Some technical remarks. As I've said, this will be recorded. Second, for your Q&A, for your questions, you can use the Q&A function. For comments, you can use the comment function. Now we come to the content, and we start with Professor Dirk Messner. He's the president of the German Environment Agency and still a co-director at the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg Center for Global Cooperation Research at the University of Duisburg-Essen. And many of you might know him still from being formerly director of the German Development Institute for years and years, and really shaping the institute and the debate at that time. Internationally, he is recognized as an expert for globalization and global governance, transformation pathways to sustainability, decarbonization, and digital challenges, international cooperation and societal change. So these topics which are key for today's debate. So I'm very happy to give you the floor, Dirk. You take it from here.
So first of all, thank you very much, Camilla, for your kind words. What I'm trying to do now during the next 10 minutes is to frame a bit what we are interested in and what we are aiming at. And after my brief talk, Jenny Trölsch will then dive into specific cases and present empirical material around the issue which we would like to talk about. And the issue we would like to talk about is sustainable adaptation pathways and where we stand in this debate and how we can use this concept, this tool, to have better integrated and more comprehensive and systemic concepts to drive national development and local development towards comprehensive sustainability. So this is what we are interested in. My part, the narrative, and then Jenny afterwards, case studies and empirical material. So if we go to the next slide, please, Benedikt. I would like to start with what the HLPF this year is focusing on. And the HLPF meeting this year is focusing on sustainable and resilient recovery from the COVID pandemic by building on inclusive and effective pathways for the achievement of the 2030 agenda. And in addition, if you look to the ministerial declaration for this year's HLPF meeting, the member states of the United Nations also are stressing that we need to enhance rapidly and urgently adaptive capacities. We need to reduce vulnerabilities against climate change, but also other risks and extreme weather events and volatilities in our societies. This is the background. And against this background, what we would like to present to you today and then discuss with you also is whether the concept of sustainable adaptation pathways is a good tool to integrate our different policy settings towards a common goal, which is which is sustainable and resilient recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic. So sustainable adaptation pathways is what we are focusing on. When you look at the next slide, some very brief words about the situation in which we are, the context, no? And I would like to mention only 3 things here. Yesterday, during our HLPF day #1, we had serious discussions in many different events and at many different panels about the SDGs and their implementation in times of crisis. So the background was pandemic and how to move out of the pandemic and how to manage the economic and social impacts of the pandemic, linking these kind of challenges with the SDG agenda. But it is not only, of course, the pandemic, it goes beyond that. Remember all the IPCC reports of the last years, and I brought you one slide from this context. No? What this slide is emphasizing is that we are really under huge time pressure, because here you see the tipping point debate, to say so. No? If you look at this time scale, 2000 to 2018, if you would have had a discussion on climate issues and climate impact in 2007, only 13 years ago, we would have argued based on our knowledge in these days that beyond, as you can see here, 3 to 4 degrees and even more global warming, we run into the dangerous territory of tipping points. What we would argue today, what we are arguing today, 2018 and beyond, current times, is that already around 2 degrees, tipping points are very near. So this implies that urgency is an important point. We have to act quickly. And then as a result, obviously, of all of these climate debates, we have risk debates. And risks are about weather and droughts, but it goes also beyond environmental risks and environmental driven risks. It's also about volatilities related to financial markets. So the whole risk debate. So these are our 3 angles. It's about the SDGs, social and economic implications of the pandemic. It is about the IPCC and the climate challenges. And then it is about risk management in a world of volatilities. And all of that needs to be managed with under high time pressures. This is the situation in which we are in. Benedict, if we go to the next slide, with the next slide, I would like to mention that actually we have exactly, Camilla, you mentioned this at the beginning, no? We have 3 big agendas to manage these turbulences, to manage these development challenges. And this is the SDG agenda, the 17 goals, is the Paris Agreement, the climate challenge, and then it is the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, managing a world with volatilities, uncertainties, and risks. So against this background, we have been interested in our project, and we are presenting you reflections which are coming out of this project during our event here. We have been interested in our joint project in the sustainable development pathways and adaptation pathways, because the interesting thing, if you look at these adaptation pathways, is that they are aiming at developing a framework for mentioning and integrating all these 3 agendas in totality. So our question here, which we would like to discuss with you, is, does this make sense and does this work? If we look at these sustainable adaptation pathways and how they are working and how they are structured, do they help us to really integrate the different aspects of these 3 huge and comprehensive agendas, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, and the SDGs? So at the next slide, Benedict, I wanted to strengthen that. If you zoom into the sustainable adaptation pathways, you can see that they are trying to integrate the different aspects of these 3 complex agendas, Paris, Sendai, and the SDGs, because the authors and drivers and pioneers of the sustainable adaptation pathways are arguing, and I agree with that, and Jenny afterwards will give us a case studies and examples for that, that all these 3 big agendas, actually at the end of the day, if you narrow them down, have 3 core elements in common, because they are all about reducing vulnerabilities. They are all about enhancing quality of life and social inclusion in our societies. And in doing so reducing vulnerabilities and enhancing quality of life, they are aiming at building more resilient societies. So these 3 elements, this is something which all of the overarching concepts we are currently working with, Sendai, Paris, and the SDG concept are having in common. Therefore, for us, the sustainable adaptation pathways, aiming at integrating our policies and strategies towards all three big agendas at once, is something we became interested in. So let's go to the next slide, Benedict. And if you dive into these discussions about sustainable adaptation pathways, when we drove into the discussions about sustainable adaptation pathways, we found 4 elements which appear again and again. The first element is that there are different pathway approaches in the field of sustainable adaptation pathways. There is a debate about climate resilient pathways for development. There is a debate about adaptation pathways. There is a debate about water, energy, food nexus, aiming at exactly the integration of all these 3 huge agendas. So this is what we find. There is a diversity of approaches in the field of sustainable adaptation pathways. The second point which we found is that all of these different approaches in the field of sustainable adaptation pathways have a very strong assessment approach. So assessment of vulnerabilities, assessment of enabling factors to enhance the quality of life of people, assessment is a very important starting point for building these kind of pathways towards sustainable adaptation. And the third element, which we always found in these different approaches which are out there, is that these are all multi-stakeholder approaches. So they go beyond the market will drive it, some incentives, and the market will then drive the processes. They also go beyond state-driven efforts and state-driven frameworks. And you always find multi-stakeholder approaches where private sector, science, state, local actors need to come together. This is the third element which is characterizing these different approaches to sustainable adaptation pathways. What we also find, which is important, is that climate-oriented pathways and risk-oriented, risk management-oriented pathways do not automatically contribute to sustainable development in the sense of social inclusiveness. So you can formulate and build pathways towards decarbonization or risk management without explicitly driving societies towards social inclusion. So this is something which for us is very important, because the quality of life aspect is something which we emphasize very strongly. So we are interested in sustainable adaptation pathways which really combine the climate aspect with the risk aspect and the quality of life perspective. On the next slide, I would like to mention several characteristics of these sustainable adaptation pathways. And this is a preparation for then the case studies with which Jenny will present in a second. So I would like to mention 4 new aspects here. The first one is, or the five ones. The first one is something which I already mentioned. It is that all these pathways, adaptation pathways, trying to bring the 3 agendas we are talking about together. It is about balancing these agendas, integrating those agendas, and coherent pathways. The second element, which is very important and a very important characteristic of the approach itself, is that they are all mentioning specific socio-ecological contexts. So on the one hand side, this is a universal approach. On the other hand side, it is very much a localized approach, looking for localized and specific solutions. So there is no one fits all. There are different pathways because the socio-ecological contexts are different from country to country. A third element, which we also find in those approaches and pathway debates which we are interested in, is that there is a central message about leaving no one behind. So risk management, but leaving no one behind. Climate mitigation and adaptation, and leaving no one behind. For us, this is a very important normative orientation. Element number 4 is then the assessment character of the pathways. And all of these pathways start with an assessment of vulnerabilities. And they all focus on the exposure of the considered population to climate change and other environmental changes and risks. They all focus on the sensitivity to climate change of the livelihood systems and ecosystem services that target populations relies on. and they all focus on the adaptive capacities of the targeted population. So the assessment of vulnerabilities with these different aspects is something which all of these different approaches and the diversity of pathways do have in common. And based on this kind of assessment of vulnerabilities, the next steps are how to link this with improving the quality of life of people and building resilient society. The last element is then that all of these pathway debates also focus on enabling factors which drive the transformation. And the most important elements here are institutional capabilities, socio-political and cultural capabilities, of course, financial and economic capabilities, but also nature-based solutions and nature-based and ecosystem-based starting points in different socio-ecological contexts. So enabling factors are something which the approaches are all interested in and which they connect with their assessment of vulnerabilities. My last point in my last minute is about the implementation. We also have been, based on our 20 case studies, and Jenny will drive us into the case studies in a second, we have been looking at the implementation success factors. And I would like to mention 3 elements here coming to an end. And I would like to emphasize that these 3 elements, which we are finding as success factors for the implementation of the SAPs, are very similar to other transformation discussions and the success factors of governance, which we find in these other more broadly oriented transformation debates. And these 3 elements are the following. The first one is that successful implementation of SAPs is about bottom-up processes and high acceptance of local populations. So strong activism and strong engagement of local actors in the transformation processes is something which is of high importance. So importing these kind of strategies and implementing them from the top will not work. The second element is very important and very challenging because it is about integrated management and integrated governance beyond ministerial sectors, because we have systemic approaches here, bringing climate, economic development, technological development together. So this kind of governance beyond the silos is something which is absolutely necessary to move forward, but it is challenging. Jenny will talk about success cases in this regard. So beyond silo governance is element number 2. And element number 3, and this is my last point, which I wanted to mention in this introduction here. My last point is that you can also see that successful implementation has to do with leadership. We very often found that pioneers are driving this process. Leadership of certain organizations at the beginning of the process is very important. Therefore, working with these pioneers, but embedding their activities in local stakeholder settings is something which we urgently recommend. So this have been my conceptual considerations and the overall narrative, which we have been working with in our project. And Jenny now will drive you directly into successful and interesting case studies to understand better the specificities of the pathways we are talking about. Thank you very much for your patience.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dirk, for this inspiring and tour de force presentation through the topics we want to address. Jenny, you heard vulnerability, quality of life, resilience, assessment and shaping then pathways with the stakeholders involved, and also the tension, climate and risk solutions might not actually address social inclusiveness, and how do we manage that so it's actually a sustainable adaptation pathway. There's coherence. And Jenny, please take us to the details. But before you do that, I want to introduce you quickly. Jenny Trölsch is a senior fellow at Ecologic Institute. For more than a decade now, she already deals with questions of adaptation at the Institute, and she coordinates actually our adaptation work. Her work focus is on the cost-benefit evaluation of environmental goods and services, climate adaptation, and regional bioeconomies. please, Jenny, take us through some key insights of the study.
Thanks a lot, Camilla. Hope you can see now my presentation. I'm very glad to present the concept of sustainable adaptation pathways, which we have developed in a project funded by the German Environment Agency. As Mr. Messner has already mentioned, some key aspects which we are starting from. Here only some short messages. I think you all are aware that a number of SDG goals and targets linked to climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction, but integrative approaches in practice are still rare. We can see that some practical challenges are out there. For example, a lack of institutional capacities or insufficient funding, for example, especially for integrative actions. And furthermore, we have already 3 very complex agendas in itself. And these 3 agendas all have a very different characteristics, referring to their legal status, different scope, or also to a different character. Based on this, we have developed the concept of sustainable adaptation pathways with the objective of facilitating synergetic implementation of these 3 agendas: the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework. Our assessment and our concept is based on the analysis of interlinkages between these policy agendas, especially looking at the objectives and instruments. We screened a wide range of existing pathway approaches which are developed in the literature, and we especially looked at 20 case studies throughout the world and used them to illustrate our concept. You have seen this picture already, and now I want to go a bit more into detail of the approach. We developed the sustainable adaptation pathways also based on the assessment of the case studies, especially the dynamic elements of sustainable adaptation pathways are gathered based on our case study analysis. And these dynamic elements, which you can see here in the lower part of the picture, are understood as enabling factors for the implementation of integrative actions. You can see that they are categorized in 3 different categories, and it's important to mention that for the most of the adaptation pathways, just a selection of dynamic elements are relevant. Furthermore, so the sustainable adaptation pathways are understood as a set of adaptation measures which are characterized by these dynamic elements. Furthermore, the socio-ecological context interacts with these dynamic elements of the pathways and influences the importance of these elements and of individual elements. One of the aims of the concept is to increase the adaptive capacities of people and institutions, and with this reduce vulnerabilities and also to strengthen social, environmental, and also economic aspects of sustainable development. We don't see the pathway approach as a static and fixed. So the pathways, in our understanding, are dynamic and can be adjusted over time, or need to be adjusted over time, and are based on feedback loops and also iterations. Now looking a bit more into examples, as mentioned already, we have linked here some of the dynamic elements with some case studies which we looked into detail. You can find all of these case studies in our publication. We summarize there or describe them in this appendix of our report. I just want to pick some examples here because I can't go through this full list. So, for example, we came across a very interesting approach when we were looking into stakeholder involvement, especially in Santiago de Chile. looking into the climate change adaptation plan, or the development of the climate change adaptation plan in the city. They used a novel approach for the city, which is characterized by a bottom-up integration of stakeholder, and it includes a series of 10 roundtables with a broad range of stakeholders. And the result of this novel approach for the city was that the social and political acceptance of the developed plan was quite high. Also, it has to be said that it was very resource intensive and time consuming, this process. Another example I just want to mention is the coordination across sectors. Looking at the Colombian NDC, which especially has the aim to integrate adaptation with the other two agendas, you can see that the National Development Plan for Colombia integrates adaptation as one of its priorities. And you can also see that some of the sectoral and territorial instruments established there are integrating climate change considerations. On the following slide, we would like to illustrate how we have used the structure of our case study analysis. This might also provide a good basis for future applications of the concept. We started with to look into the social ecological context, especially referring to social and environmental vulnerabilities, in this case of deforestation in Ecuador. Furthermore, we then analyzed the sustainable adaptation pathway, and especially looking into measures which have been implemented. And in this case, we looked at especially at the Sociobosque program. For example, it includes a national conservation agreement scheme based on voluntary actions to protect forest areas, but also a number of other activities. And based on this, we identified the key dynamic elements which we found relevant for this pathway. Here, just to mention one, diversified funding. So the landowners can get monetary can get a monetary incentive for and this especially targeting the low-income regions in this area. Furthermore, a second example we would like to show you is the adaptation planning in Denmark. And here we can say on socio-ecological context that the adaptive capacities in Denmark are relatively high, but also vulnerabilities will increase, and especially related to river flooding and coastal flooding. And this sustainable adaptation pathways also includes a range of measures. For example, that all of the Danish municipalities need to establish a climate change adaptation strategy. Furthermore, a task force was established, which is cross-sectoral instrument, which is used to gather knowledge and data for the government, the municipalities. And based on these measures, we identified also here a number of dynamic elements. For example, I just want to take now one is the flexible governance structures, which can be seen, for example, that as part of the task force, mobile units have been established, which are supporting the municipalities, traveling to the municipalities and consult them on local implementation possibilities. So based on our analysis, we came up with a number of main conclusions, which show what, from our point of view, is needed to implement sustainable adaptation pathways in practice. And as already mentioned, we can also say that one-size-fits-all solutions are not suitable to realize sustainable adaptation. We need locally specific measures, for example, based on in-depth assessments of vulnerabilities and also looking into the socio-ecological context. We should be aware of path dependencies and also log-in effects to develop content-specific measures. Furthermore, we think it's important to implement flexible and multi-benefit approaches, for example, like nature-based solutions, which have a range of co-benefits. Measures should be also adjustable over time, so that it can be taken consideration of socioeconomic development, but also of climatic changes. And furthermore, it is discussed that current funding streams should focus a bit more on multi-objective projects. Furthermore, political leadership and stakeholder involvement are important aspects especially for cross-sectoral implementation. And political support helps and guides the implementation of the sustainable adaptation pathways and supports the coordination across sectors. For example, via instruments like a multi-sector coordination unit or also lead agencies. And furthermore, stakeholder involvement and participatory approaches are important to develop open processes in which local knowledge, but also adaptation narratives can be taken into consideration. A further important point are to use existing instruments as entry points for implementation, as well as existing institutional frameworks. For example, like national adaptation plans, but also NDCs or development plans or disaster risk reductions, which are already in place. And our last aspects, which we would like to highlight, are the importance of robust monitoring and evaluation frameworks. So we have seen that there is a need to have a robust framework for monitoring and evaluation to identify needs for readjustment and improvement. And there's also room for further developments on the framework and related indicators which link the different agendas, for example, via a joint information system or also via enhanced data sharing between key actors, which can support a number of assessments and implementation processes. Yes, if you're interested in further reading on this concept, we developed a conceptual and analytical paper, which is a bit longer version and description of the concept. It's accompanied by an appendix of 20 case studies. And we prepared a short and precise version within a policy brief. And all of these papers are published on the webpage of the German Environment Agency, Umweltbundesamt.de. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention and would like to give the word back to Camilla.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for this presentation. We are a bit over time, but that is why I make it short now, so we can start with the debate. We will now have the panel. I will introduce each panelist when he or she is introduced and speaks for the first time. Then each of these panelists have a few minutes to discuss with me. And after we had them all, we join again as a full panel and then address also questions you might put in the Q&A section. So when you ask questions, please also indicate who you want this question to be answered by. And be aware, Mr. Tornquist has to leave a bit early, 5 minutes early. So I announce already that if you have questions, particularly to Mr. Tornquist, be spot on and early on so he can answer that. All right, but we start now with Madhushree Chatterjee. She is a Chief of Natural Resources and Interlinkages branch at the Division for Sustainable Goals of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at UNDESA in New York. So she is with us today from New York, so right at the center of action. She's also Secretary of UN Water, which is really fitting for us today because then she can take us to some very specific aspects of the things we discussed today. And she brings a combination of substantive experience in the implementation not only of the 2030 agenda, but also of understanding the strategic direction of the organization. So that will be most valuable today. And she has actually provided quite a bit of leadership already in this context, inter alia in the strategic planning and communication service unit, but also in the discussion on the 2030 agenda as a program manager. So welcome, Madhushree. And let's start with the specifics, so we kind of get to understand what that means. You serve as Secretary for UN Water, an interagency mechanism that coordinates the UN work on water issues. And as we all know, this is relevant not only in the context of disaster risk reduction and in the context of climate change, but also for SDG 6. Can you provide us with examples how you try to align the SDG 6 with the Paris Agreement and the DRR objectives? And where do you see synergies or potential trade-offs? Madhushree.
Thank you, Camilla, for that very interesting question. And thank you to the Institute also for inviting me to this very timely discussion. I realize that time is short, so let me dive straight into what I want to say. So UN Water, as many of you know, consists of over 30 entities that are working on water and sanitation related issues. So we have WHO that works on health, FAO on agriculture, then we have UNDRR also, which works on disaster risk reduction, UNFCCC. So if you can see that, interlinkages will be embedded in the work that we do. So we have to try to align the targets of SDG 6 with other global agendas, such as Paris, Sendai, and so on and so forth. So how do we approach our work? We naturally work to provide an integrated approach to policies by identifying emerging issues and developing effective collaborative responses. And of course, these landmark agreements that we've heard from Professor Messner and Jenny, they already have provided us with a good sort of a roadmap or framework, if you will, to provide integrated solutions. So that said, let me start with what UN Water did to address these issues in an integrated manner. So given that we have barely 9 years left for the implementation of the 2030 agenda, UN Water family launched last year the SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework to deliver fast results for SDG 6 at increased scale and strengthen system-wide collaboration at the country level. Now, we quickly realized that all of the integrated approach that we are talking about cannot be sort of targeted towards just the SDG 6 targets. So naturally, we steered clear from focusing on targets. Instead, we looked at what were the 5 key bottlenecks to achieving SDG 6. But I believe these bottlenecks are, I think they kind of are bottlenecks also for the other SDGs. So what were the 5 key bottlenecks that we found? It's financing. We need to optimize financing. Data and information. We need to build trust through data generation and exchange for decision-making and accountability. Capacity development. We need to focus on human capacity to deliver SDG 6. Innovation. We need to leverage and scale up innovative practices and technologies. And governance. That is, we need to make SDG 6 everyone's business, but through cross-sector and transboundary collaboration, clearer roles, stakeholder involvement, and effective institutions. So, these are sort of the 5 accelerators that we are speaking towards now. This was launched last year and it was very well received, including by member states. Now, in today's presentation, we heard from Professor Messner and others, and I'm sure we'll hear from others as well, about how stakeholder involvement is so important. So UNDESA, I want to now step back from UN Water Secretary role and go into what UNDESA is doing. So our Undersecretary General has embraced this concept very well. And we are sort of trying to co-coordinate with UNESCO this issue on capacity development. So UNDESA does not have field presence. So all our work has to be demand driven. And when we say demand driven, it has to be context specific, it has to be localized and use local sort of analysis and data. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to first see what is the expertise available at the UN system level, what are some of the trade-offs that we can leverage, and then based on that, we are going to basically address the issues of countries. So given that this is demand driven, we sort of offer our expertise to countries, but we also try to see from country experiences what their specific vulnerabilities are. We want them to do a little bit of homework, like, give us your needs, give us what you need from the UN system so that we can effectively implement. But at the same time, we need leadership. I think the report mentions leadership. So using our convening power, we are trying to get different ministries in one room, say agriculture, health, and so that they can discuss what are some of the trade-offs that have to be made, what are some of the synergies that have to be achieved to be able to accomplish SDG 6. So herein, basically, we are talking about NGOs, we are talking about local municipalities, we are talking about also using indigenous and traditional knowledge, because climate change has now affected all areas of our work. We want to make sure they make risk-informed decisions. We want to make sure that the solutions that the UN system together can offer actually works well for the country in question. My unit also works on ocean-related issues. So the solutions that we sort of provide for, say, a coastal community will be very different from a country like Nepal, which has a whole set of different issues. So this is what we are trying to do now, and this is what we are hoping will generate interest. In fact, at the HLPF, as many countries present their voluntary national reviews. When we did a synthesis of this and analysis of these voluntary national reviews, there were a few countries that said that it was becoming difficult for them to work together. The siloed approach was what was going forward, and that was not helping them achieve their goals. So this is what we are trying to do through our capacity development initiative, to have a very targeted but a collaborative effort among not only ministries, but also among the UN system. So I will stop here. I think I've taken up 3 minutes of my time. So thank you, Camilla, for that question. Very dear to our hearts. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will jump now to the next speaker, but I want to highlight that we've heard how important data and information is. We will come to that with the next speaker. That's why I highlight that. Also, the universal approach, but then the localized solution was underlined, and I think that's quite in line with the findings we had, and that there is actually a cross-sectoral leadership needed. Now, we come to Loretta Hieber Girardet. Welcome, Loretta. Very good to have you. Loretta is the Chief of Risk Knowledge Monitoring and Capacity Development at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And she is placed in Geneva, so another continent, but still within the UN system. So we stay global and move across the globe. She was previously the chief of a regional office of UNDRR, also in another continent that was in the Asia Pacific. She was living in Bangkok. And her background is right now in the UN system, but she has also extensive NGO experience. So she really knows different fields and different perspectives. Now, I just mentioned the data sharing challenge, or actually it was Madhushree mentioning that and how important that is. In many countries, data sharing is very fragmented, and you have data for disaster risk reduction and for adaptation, but they are collected and analyzed by different actors. And how do we actually achieve the adequate data sharing? Some national platforms obviously facilitate that already across sectors. And one example is the Brazil example of Adaptation. It's a platform where they try to integrate that. But where do you see from a UN perspective, the challenges you encounter when there is the aim of joint monitoring and the sharing of knowledge? Loretta.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe just to start off by thanking Dirk and Jenny for the presentations and for the papers. I found the case studies really quite interesting and very useful for our work. Yes, data. Of course, what we're aiming for is always evidence-based decision-making, whether it's around development action, humanitarian action, DRR, adaptation planning, and that's often what's lacking. So before tackling the issue of monitoring, I think I'd like to hone in on something I think Dirk had mentioned around assessments being a common feature of all of the three frameworks. And I think one of the big challenges we're seeing in terms of a coherent implementation of the 2030 agenda is indeed the fact that these practitioners, whether they're the development actors, the DRR actors, the climate change actors, do not have a shared understanding of risk. They do not have as a common foundation for the development of their strategies and plans this joined up and shared understanding of both climate and non-climate risks. And so that data that would underpin risk-informed decision-making is often extremely fragmented. And that's because different government institutions have been given responsibility for implementing and overseeing the implementation of each of these frameworks. So it's the Ministry of Environment, perhaps for the Paris Agreement. It is the National Disaster Risk Management Agencies when it comes to Sendai. Really breaking those institutional silos it is a challenge. And you've talked about assessing vulnerabilities is key. When we see the entire risk spectrum is key, the vulnerabilities, exposure, capacities, as well as the hazards. So that's maybe a very first point. Without that really shared understanding of risk, and we certainly have seen this in the context of COVID, where perhaps the health sector had understood pandemics as a risk, but certainly the other sectors did not have in place the appropriate data and analysis in time to deal with the crisis. So that's a challenge. Also, another challenge is that we don't always speak the same language between the different practitioners. If I just look at the term loss and damage, it has a different meaning in the climate world as it does in disaster risk reduction. So we're not using the same terminologies, the same definitions, and so that creates some barriers. We are also seeing really uneven data quality, and this makes analysis challenging. If I look at Sendai Framework Monitor, the reporting on disaggregated data, sex and age, income, it's just very, very rare to see it consistently provided. And of course, this really impedes what I think Dirk had mentioned, this leave no one behind. We cannot have inclusive approaches if we don't have the data to back it up. I also think another issue that's important is that we're not capturing data at the local level. And if you look at the impact of climate change right now, it's manifesting itself in terms of an increase in high frequency, low intensity disaster events at a very local level. And without the ability to capture that data, it really brings us into challenges in terms of understanding the impact of climate and disaster risk on sustainable development. If I just look at the question of economic valuation of losses, this is also very challenging because we do not have common costing measures. But finally, I think a final point I would raise about the challenges is that we're actually not using the data we have. We hear often that, oh, we don't have data. Well, in many cases, the data is there, but it's not being used appropriately. And if I could just give the example of the SDG metrics, where quite a lot of data can be captured on vulnerability, but it's not consistently used by disaster risk management authorities or by the climate actors either. Now, having said all of that, the good news is that I do see a real shift occurring right now in terms of trying to close these gaps and address these challenges. And I think one of the shifts that I'm witnessing and participating is, and it goes to the core of your theme about, integrated approaches, is moving away from looking at disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation as isolated but connected endeavors, and really trying to promote the concept of comprehensive risk management. And comprehensive risk management has as at its very core an integration between DRR and adaptation, climate change adaptation, really focusing on how do you integrate climate change, including especially the data, into national DRR strategies, but also how are we ensuring that we have risk-informed national adaptation planning. And so there is a big push, and this is being rolled out right now, including the LDC and SIDS. A second advance that I am seeing right now is through a program that we are leading called the Global Risk Assessment Framework. And the aim here is to provide a common platform to be used for adaptation planning, risk reduction planning, and the SDGs, which aggregates multiple data sets to be used to create a profile, a risk profile of countries. And to use this information, again, going back to what I had said earlier, the data is there, but it's sitting in different ministries, and it's not being aggregated, it's not being analyzed. So we are working now with countries to roll this out so they have this aggregated data set, as well as some additional capacity to analyze it. We're also seeing an improvement in disaster loss accounting. And this has been quite critical because of this, what I had mentioned earlier, this lack of subnational data. And yet that's where the increase in climate-related disasters is occurring. And already this is operational in 120 countries, but we're seeing a gap between the availability of data and the use of the data to inform decision-making. You mentioned the joint monitoring. As you are aware, the monitoring is already, probably you're aware, part of the monitoring for the Sendai Framework.
If you make it short, if you can make it just your last minute, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, and then my final point is that there is right now an interagency expert group on disaster-related statistics, which is meeting at the global level. That's looking at enhancing the overall quality of data and including improving climate-related statistics. So in summary, many challenges, but really some quite good innovations and initiatives underway to address these.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And actually also pointing to the tensions, but also pointing to the opportunities building up with these new dynamics and the new numbers and the new approaches you take. And again, this link from going from the universal to the local and back again, how that interacts to actually get to good approaches, successful approaches. Now, with that in mind, we turn to our next speaker. Thank you, Loretta. And we turn to Rodrigo Rodriguez Tornquist. Welcome, Rodrigo. He's Secretary of Climate Change, Sustainable Development and Innovation at the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Argentina. So we go from the global now to the national level. And there he is a member of the steering committee on the UN International Resources Panel. And he actually has a strong integrative focus within the region because formerly he was the president of the LIC platform. So that's the network of organizations and individuals working in the promotion, design, and implementation of low-emission development strategies in Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition, he's professor at the National University of St. Martin. So welcome, Rodrigo. And we now have a few questions to you because your title already kind of suggests that Argentina is taking an integrated approach to climate change and sustainable development. In your very person, you are the integrated representation of the integrated approach. And can you actually explain in a bit more detail how integrated action towards sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and climate adaptation are coordinated in Argentina at national level?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Camila. Thanks to everyone. It's a pleasure to share with you some ideas and to participate on this panel with such distinguished colleagues. I can say that in Argentina, there are two main governance bodies that work in climate change adaptation and disaster risk management, taking the Sustainable Development Framework as a cross-cutting approach. In the first place, the National Cabinet on Climate Change, which has been working since 2016 and was finally institutionalized in 2019 through our National Climate Change Law. Under the Cabinet, last year, we created a disaster risk management working group that is coordinated by the Ministry of Security with the support of the Ministry of Defense, represented by the National Meteorological Service and the Ministry of Science and Technology. In this working group, we carried out several training workshops regarding adaptation and disaster risk reduction, taking into account the importance of bridging the gap in capacity building among different governmental areas. Moreover, our National Climate Change Directorate and the Ministry of Security are planning to facilitate a series of workshops to the civil defense services of local governments in order to enhance the adaptation and disaster risk reduction approaches in a coordinated manner on the ground. All these activities and the outcomes of this work are aligned with our second NDC and the second adaptation communication submitted in December last year. They are also linked with our National Adaptation Plan, which is currently being developed, which considers disaster risk as a cross-cutting pillar to frame adaptation options. In relation to the second governance body, in 2017, the National Disaster Risk Management System, called SINAGIR, Sistema Nacional de Gestión Integral de Riesgo, was created under the authority of the Ministry of Security. This system is organized in technical commissions, and one of them is devoted to climate change issues under the coordinator of our National Climate Change Directorate. In this context, we have another important instrument, which is the Disaster Risk Reduction Plan for the 2018-2023 years. And we are currently updating the climate change work plan for the present and incoming year. Right now, our main challenge is to align the objectives of these two spaces, the Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group of the National Climate Change Cabinet and the SINAGIR, Technical Commission on Climate Change. For doing so, in practical terms, we carry out monthly meetings to discuss the general objectives and activities that are going to lead us to a more articulated work in terms of adaptation and disaster risk reduction. In general terms, our suggestion is to promote participative spaces, open dialogues, listen all the levels of governments and try to articulate, because the only way to face the adverse effects of climate change we need to face is being fraternal and hearing and participating with everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So what I hear from what you say, it's actually about mainstreaming, it's about linking and integrating. And to accomplish that in a complex setting, actually meeting and discussing is important. The latter point, which you mentioned, was participation. We heard that throughout the speeches of different panelists today already, and of the introductory we had today. So can you give me in 2 minutes just good examples from Argentina, how actually participatory approaches worked well, in which context in these topic areas?
We need to work from a technical and political perspective at the subnational level and in conjunction with different stakeholders. In order to operationalize this interaction in both adaptation and disaster risk reduction agendas, we have the Provincial Coordination Roundtable on the National Climate Change Cabinet. And it's the space where we articulate among the national government, the provincial level, and the city level. We need to work integrated with a cross-cutting agenda, but also articulating not only the environmental agenda, but transport, energy, land use change, agriculture, and try to coordinate at the different levels on the different guidelines. So the only way to do it is to promote a very open dialogue. We understand that the ability to address adaptation and to reduce risk will depend on the level of consciousness of our people and on the level of preparedness we can have for moving forward in a very fast and effective way.
Thank you very much. I would love to talk long about that, because how to integrate that over all these levels and then to be fast. Dirk Messner already in the introductory statements that said that participatory approaches and speed can be actually, create some tension. So if anybody in the audience has an interest to understand deeper how you do that, please post a question in the chat. But now we come to our next panelist. So we stay in South America, but we move from beautiful Argentina to beautiful Ecuador. And David Jacome is our next speaker. He is Metropolitan Director of Resilience and Chief Resilience Officer in the city of Quito. And he is a resilience advisor also for UNDP, with the main task to develop and implement the resilience strategy in Quito. He's also professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica in Quito. And he was actually part of various programs, but including also such programs like the Program Committee of ICLE on Resilient Cities World Congress. So he actually has a perception of many different cities. David, please switch on your video. Ah, there you are. Beautiful to see your face. Wonderful. So you are Chief Resilience Officer in the city of Quito, as I already said. And Quito is already experiencing the changes induced by climate change in multifaceted ways. So how do you adapt, and how do you link adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development in this context?
Thank you very much for the question, Camilla. Thank you very much for the presentations and the great report. It's very useful. I'm sorry if there is some noise in the background, but I'm not in Quito right now. I'm attending some other activities outside the city, and so that is not within my control. But regarding the question, in the city of Quito, we have a specific approach where we depart from the fact that any system that does not work properly before a disruptive event is likely to be more easily failing during these times and have more difficulties recovering. So we have two steps. First of all, we identify how and where a system fails. For example, where in the city of Quito we have food insecurity and why? Where are the most vulnerable and what is preventing them to access healthy and nutritious food? Because they are the ones most affected, and they find more difficulties provisioning before, during, and after. And this is true, and that was really evident during the last during the coronavirus emergency. And of course, analog analysis can be done on other systems, such as mobility systems. This allows us to understand and to plan and to improve these situations and to anticipate actions. It also helps us understand how they get deteriorated as climate change, for example, or other threats are impacting us. Let's not forget that Quito, for example, is a city with a multiple threat city. We have earthquakes and volcanic eruptions also right around the corner. Our second step is designing adaptive capacities in these systems. Two examples are, for example, the creation of synergies between different actors in different levels of government, the private sector, the academia, and communities in the territory. That allows us to work in a vertical level, but also in a horizontal level, and getting different perspectives coming from different sectors of society. but also by improving the supporting urban infrastructure to also embed adaptive capacities. For example, by including nature-based solutions, such as around mobility systems or public markets that are key or crucial while providing different systems in the city. Measuring and reporting is done by linking our development plan, which is the main instrument that governs every action carried on by the municipality of Quito, but it is also part of the monitoring system. That's how we connect every action that we do. That's how we measure, and that's how we also inform either or connect with the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, or the new urban agenda. That's how the city works, putting first people and their well-being at the core of our actions, and then thinking about how to improve those living conditions, those lives, and then also how to keep them safe.
Thank you very much. So the focus on the vulnerable, also to understand why they are in the situation they are, and trying to improve that via measures which actually are quite in line with what we heard before. So the study underlines the importance of learning from also failed approaches. You are part of the Resilient Cities Network. If you look at it just quickly, maybe 2 examples, what did you hear where in other places something worked or did not work, what we should know about to take on board for the future?
Yeah, I think that is a great question, and that also relates to the fact that there are already a number of city networks out there that already have been identified as a means to streamline and accelerate cross-pollination processes between different cities. And this is true. In practice, some cities are more advanced in identifying challenges while implementing policies to face similar risks. But also they are more advanced in solving problems. What we find, for example, within the Resilient Cities Network or within the ICLE is that not every policy or not every solution is at the beginning efficient or effective to solving problems. And solving those problems to solve the larger problem is also already challenging. But they are already pretty good at doing this. This allows other cities, while being part of these networks, to avoid these problems and to look more broadly at different possible solutions. That means saving time, but also that means saving human resources. The relation of the City of Quito and my peer CROs has become a sort of an open library of policies and good practices coming from around the world that inform the implementation of the city resilience strategy, as well as an opportunity to give to other cities what we have been able to solve in an efficient manner, while also helping those other cities avoid committing the same mistakes that we did at the beginning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I know we are running over time, but I want to bring in one more question to Dirk. One more question, because we talked about the many big crises and the many big frameworks, which were basically drafted years ago before COVID hit us. So maybe now link it in a short answer, the COVID pandemic and its consequences for increased coherence efforts in the context of the frameworks we are discussing. Are there potential positive or negative effects on this approach, this aim for coherence and actually creating a better, sustainable, resilient world?
Yeah, Camilla, I try to be brief, and I would like to make maybe only 2 points. The first point is that we are talking a lot about complexities, and I think that we can run into a complexity trap, actually. So when we talk about all these interlinkages, to reduce complexity, my first point would be, and this is what we try to do now in the European context with the European Green Deal, because you are asking how we are managing the current crisis. In Europe, the answer to the crisis is the European Green Deal. And we try to narrow down these complexity traps to 5 sectors which we are focusing on. It is the cities and mobility sector, it is our industries, it is our food system, which is related to all ecosystems, and it is the energy sector. This is the economy. And then we have all investments in human capabilities. These are the 5 main transformation areas. And what we have to learn now, and I think there is still a lot to do, is that we have not only to look from these 3 perspectives, climate, the SDGs, and then the risk analysis, at these systems, and do in isolation and develop in isolation strategies. We have to try to organize coherent approaches here. No? And I see 3 challenges in this regard. The first one is, and I think we can solve this. The first one is that we have, from these 3 perspectives, we have joint goals which we can all agree upon. And this is the vulnerability issue, reducing vulnerabilities. This is the risk perspective and uncertainty perspective, and the resilience perspective. So we have a common goal system. Then we have to look on co-benefits. If we are looking at these 5 transformation arenas I talked about, from these 3 perspectives, where are the co-benefit fields? You know, how can we combine bringing the emissions down, reducing vulnerabilities, and at the same time improve social inclusion? So co-benefits is the second key. And the last key, and I'm already coming to an end, Camilla, is the time horizon, because very often our reactions, also during COVID now, to risks and vulnerabilities which are current, in a current disaster situation, very often the answers are short-term. We need to balance short-termism and long-term strategies. And the short-term investments need to be aligned with our long-term goals towards sustainability, in the sense of reducing the vulnerabilities, managing the risks, and having a more resilient society. So these are my 3 co-issues there: co-benefits, aligning time horizons, joint goal system.
Excellent, thank you so much. One could discuss that now for half an hour, but before we do that, I invite all panelists to switch on their video. And I would invite Benedict, before I have a list of questions I would love to discuss with you, but let's first have others have a word. So Benedict, please, I heard there were 1 or 2 questions in the chat. Please, Benedict.
Indeed, thanks, Camilla. So we got 2 questions now from our participants. So first question is on private sector involvement in implementing the SDGs. And this is a question directed to the distinguished panelists from the UN, so to Loretta and Madhushree. And the question is from Elisa Prenzoff from Asset 17 Management. It's a private company working at SDGs at their core. How can companies like 17 Asset Management work together with the UN and also Ecological Institute towards achieving the 2030 SDGs? How do you make the bridge between stakeholders and private companies focused on helping the stakeholders achieve the SDGs? So this is a question on this private sector involvement here. And then I directly also just get another question also to the UN panelists from Emiri Murata from the G20 Youth Climate Delegation from Japan. What action do you hope to see from the G20 nations to address bottlenecks in adaptation and disaster risk reduction in the most climate vulnerable regions of the world? How can the G20 help drive more integration between the frameworks?
Thank you. And I think there is 1 third question by Jenny. You want to present that quickly? Or we do that in the second round before we lose. So Madhushree and Loretta, the first 2 questions are to you. So one is actually linking to our aim to be participatory, how to include the private sector. And the second is how to use certain settings, certain groups, certain political groupings already to actually create the integration in this context, specifically the G20. Maybe we start with you, Loretta, and then go to you, Madhushree.
Sure, and thanks very much for the question. Well, I think there's no doubt that the private sector is absolutely key and core to not only the achievement of the SDGs, but the Paris Agreement as well as the Sendai Framework. And I can say we have tried to facilitate engagement of the private sector by setting up private sector groupings known as ARISE in different parts of the world, which brings together the private sector to look at ways that they can work to help support resilience. And we have Arise networks in Japan and the Philippines. And these are really managed by private companies themselves with our facilitation, but you have similar types of networks associated with the SDGs. And I think we're seeing increasingly certain industries really at the forefront driving change. If I think about the insurance industries right now, where they are really doing quite a lot of work around climate change, analytics, going back to that issue of data that I was previously addressing. So a lot of scope for the private sector to get involved. Maybe the second question about the G20, and here I might link it to expectations at COP26. I mean, we really see an increase in adaptation funding and operationalization of the Santiago network as two key outcomes that we're expecting from COP26. Because by scaling up adaptation and making available more resources, and of course it is the G20 that needs to be behind this, besides their responsibility to curb carbon emissions, by scaling up adaptation financing, we will be going a long way towards achieving not only the Paris Agreement, but the Sendai Framework, bearing in mind that 90% of disasters are climate related today. So these are two, maybe reflections. So over to you, Madhushree.
Excellent, Madhushree.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you for that very comprehensive but short answer, Loretta. I just want to add, the same thing, that the UN and especially UNDESA involves and engages the private sector regularly through its various mechanisms, through its various processes, and that is something that we want to happen. But we also want to see we want to see their engagement at the ground level. So that is also something that we hope to accomplish as we start rolling out and implementing our capacity development initiative in the field. Whether these 17 asset management companies will be sort of involved therein, it depends on the country in question. However, some things that the UNDESA likes to sort of engage the private sector more in and request the private sector to engage in is in terms of innovation and science and technology. That is one area where the private sector can really push forward and help local communities and regional and at the global level to ensure that we have these tools, we have these innovative capacities to implement our sustainable development goals. As far as the G20 is concerned, I'm sure everyone knows the SG has made a strong pitch for zero carbon neutrality by 2050, and also is working very closely with the G20 on this matter. How this will happen now with the pandemic is a big question, because some of the G20 members are very heavily impacted by COVID-19. However, it's this push to make sure that the long-term sustainable goals are borne in mind while we are making short-term priorities, which might be easier to accomplish and have short-term impact, but we have to bear in mind long-term environmental consequences as well. I'll stop here. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you very much. And just to mention, as it was also addressed to Ecologic Institute, we as a transdisciplinary research institute actually try to include in our research approach also the non-research actors, including business, but that would be now too long to explain, but just to mention that. And Benedict, second row of questions, please.
Yes, so we actually got two more questions. So the first one would be directed to David from Quito. A question from my colleague Jenny. What are instruments which were used in the city of Quito to identify most vulnerable systems? And which types of nature-based solutions have been used successfully to manage climate risk in the city? So this would be a question to you. And then we have another one from Judy Pierce from Nigeria, which is not specified to a specific panelist. So I think the floor would be then open. What efforts are made by the G7 Leaders Summit to a couple of months ago with regards to climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies to include also developing countries? So again, a question on the, this time G7.
Thank you very much. And I will now maybe take the round because we will then also have to close the panel. So we start with David because one question was directly to you, but then I would go to Rodrigo, to Madhushree, Loretta, and then to Dirk for the final words and final interventions, if you want to share also thoughts on what you have heard today. So we start with you, David.
Sure, thank you for the great question. When it comes to identifying the most vulnerable systems, we are not using a specific instrument. What we did is develop our own framework. I'm talking specifically, for example, the one for agri-food systems. So what we did is we took the FAO's concept of food security, and we broke it down into 4 different dimensions and like 38 factors. And that allows us to connect, for example, distribution of a vulnerable population in terms of gender, disabilities, age, or poverty, and then intersect that with the possibilities for them to access to food, but also how can they be affected by different natural hazards or man-made hazards as well. That shows us how risk is distributed in an heterogeneous way in the city, and what kind of factors are affecting that system. Because if one person has no ability to access to food, then that is an indicator of a malfunctioning system, as I was mentioning before. When it comes to nature-based solutions, I would mention 2. The first one is one that has already about 2 decades in the city of Quito, which is the water fund of the city, which aims at securing and conserving water basins that produce water for the city of Quito, but also improving the lives of communities around these basins and improving their living conditions while improving their economic activities, so that they can be also actors to really preserve these areas. That is a very good example. And the other one is one that we are developing as part of the Clever Cities Consortium, which is a Horizon 2020 project, which aims at mainly or principally reducing physical and social economic vulnerabilities in neighborhoods or barrios in the city of Quito through a participatory process, while also implementing informed activities in these places.
Thank you very much. As I said, Rodrigo had to leave early and he had to leave, so we will not have his final word. I'm sorry for that. So we go on with Madhushree.
Thank you, Camilla. And I have a question for Dirk, actually, during his research and while doing this report. One thing that we have found that is difficult to assess or even monitor is, how one policy in one sector is impacting another sector, because these are sometimes the impacts are so localized. How can we convince ministries or municipalities to actually, take or implement certain policies which clearly have benefits in another sector? And have you found a way to assess that? I know there are no shortcuts, but have you found a way to actually do this? Because that is something I think will be invaluable for a lot of local communities and countries. And if such assessments can be scaled up, that would be very helpful for the UN, I feel. Thank you, Camilla, for the opportunity.
Excellent. Good suggestions to be taken up, hopefully. Loretta.
Thanks very much. So maybe just a comment from my side. Over the last couple of years, we have spoken a lot in Asia Pacific and other parts of the world around the need for coherent implementation of the three global frameworks that we're talking about. But in my experience, when you get down to the local level, they're not so interested in frameworks. And I think there's perhaps a little bit too much attention focused on meeting the requirements and the criteria of these globally constructed frameworks. And instead, I think perhaps what we need to be focusing our attention more is how do we support countries to achieve what I call climate sensitive, risk-informed development. And if we start framing the question perhaps differently, some of these bottlenecks and barriers that we see may start to break down a little bit. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, maybe the sustainable adaptation pathway can contribute to that, hopefully. Dirk. Oh, and Dirk, may I ask you to take up the G7 question, because you're kind of in this round representing the G7 part.
Yeah, okay, I will come to the G7 and G20 in the second part of my brief intervention, Camilla. Don't worry. But first, Madhu, your question, which is very important. My easy answer is, but of course this is no easy solution. No, my answer is, don't look at sectors, forget sectors, look at systems. And I think David talked about that. No, so if you take cities as an example, in cities beforehand we have been talking to urban planners. We have been then going to the other ones, being interested in garbage. No? The next sector was mobility. And what we know is that this is interrelated, of course. No? So as David said, define the main goals for a system, an urban area, a local community, define the major objectives and aims and goals, and then bring around these goals the people from the different sectors together to change the system. No? So, I mean, this is very abstract still, but I think we need to move away from the sectors. We need to look at the systems. Therefore, I talked about these 5 main systems of change towards sustainability. No? I don't know whether this is helpful, but we could follow up on that. Now, the G7 and G20 stuff. I would like to mention a good news and a bad news regarding G7 and G20 perspectives. Now, the good news is that I'm really astonished, I must say, and therefore I'm positively looking at dynamics in the G7 and G20 context, because today, compared with the situation in 2007 and 8 and 9, the financial crisis, today, the perspective on fighting the impacts of the crisis is sustainability transformations, is climate protection. In Europe, the European Green Deal is the answer to the crisis. No? In 2008 and 9, after the financial crisis, this kind of issues, remember that, Copenhagen, this kind of issues disappeared. This time it's not disappearing. This is great. No? This is the good news. The bad news is that I'm observing that in the G20 countries, G7 countries, in the OECD countries, we are now focusing seriously, I would say, on ambitious climate protection and green economy initiatives. But we are forgetting the international cooperation aspects. Much less concern in our countries regarding international cooperation. This was actually better in 2008 and 9. In 2008 and 9, the emphasis on global cooperation was not more pronounced than now. No? So I have this good news in the OECD, G7, G20, serious ambition initiatives towards green economy and climate, which is good. Loretta, you mentioned that. No? But on the other hand side, eroding capabilities to really emphasize the international cooperation structures. And as we know, if we don't get the international cooperation dimension right, we will not solve this kind of problems. No? So this is my balance sheet. Good news, bad news. I'm sorry, I do not only have good news.
Thank you so much. It will be impossible to wrap everything up, but I want to take some takeaways. One is we have to think systemically, and that is kind of the approach we try to take also in the paper. Second, the tension between the local and the global, they need to be, for these kind of challenges, they need to be interconnected, but the global has to be paid attention to, and the local has to, we have to make that relevant to the local level, because you have local approaches, and this tension we have to be aware of and then address accordingly. Tension was also, we want acceptance, we want participation, but we have time constraints, we are under time pressure and we have to deliver. So how do we balance that? An integrative yet speedy approach. And I think there we come to the sharing of successful approaches and maybe also failures to actually advance us in this realm. We heard a lot about the foundations of knowledge and data, and we need to use data which are there and improve data which are not yet there. And again, there's the link between the local and the global. But to say something positive at the end, there are a lot of positive dynamics, especially Loretta pointed to many of them, which we can see actually on the ground. And overall, I believe that cooperation saves time and resources, as has been said on this panel already. So let's cooperate and move the issue forward. In this, I want to thank all the panelists for their input, for their thoughts, and actually also for the work they do in their respective realm, because we need that. I also want to thank the German Environment Agency, and especially Mrs. Kabel, the project officer for the project, for making this project and this event happen. Also my colleagues at Ecological Institute, of course, especially Johannes Seilnach of the events team, and my colleague Benedikt Bueb, together with Clara Oldenburg, who were instrumental in the background. So thank you very much. The event and the report are part of a project called Joint Implementation of the 2030 Agenda, SDGs, and the Paris Agreement, funded by the German Environment Agency. And I just want to point out, we do that jointly, Ecological Institute with the Öko Institute, Center for the Environment Policy Research at the Free University of Berlin, and the Disaster Research Unit at the Free University of Berlin. And there will be further publications coming up, so have an eye on it. And with that, I thank you very much. It close almost on time. Thank you for sharing, and I wish you a wonderful evening, and let's work together. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.